So welcome to Conversations on International Development. Today our guest is Professor Diane Elson. Diane Elson is one of the most important voices in the field of gender and development today. She has been named as one of 50 key thinkers on development and is noted for her work on issues of development and human rights and gender budgeting. A theme of her more recent work is gender inequality and economic and social rights. She's the author of books, Male Bias in the Development Process, which is on your reading list, and Budgeting for Women's Rights, Monitoring Government's Budgets for Compliance with CEDAW Concepts and Tools, and of many, many other publications and articles. She is chair of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which has just released its final report, and it was set up by the Women's Budget Group, of which she has been chair as well. She has also served as an advisor for UN Women and was the winner of the Lientov Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought in 2016. So very welcome, Diane, and thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us. So what I wanted to start with, I mean, your oeuvre is so big and wide, so it was really difficult to distill 2 or 3 questions for you. But starting with male bias in the development process, you were, I think, one of the first feminist economists to write on the structural adjustment policies through a gender lens. And but you've also amazingly worked on austerity measures in the UK through your work with the Women's Budget Group. So do you see the similarities between the two, SAPs and austerity? And what do you think has been the impact of these on women in both these contexts?
Let me start out by noting a few differences before I move to the similarities. There are some important differences because the structural adjustment policies of the 80s, early 90s were aimed at changing the structure of economies to make them more export oriented. And so they included measures like devaluation, trade liberalization, a whole set of other forms of deregulation, as well as cuts to public expenditure. Whereas the austerity policies following the financial crisis in 2008-9 focus more on cuts to public expenditure in order to cut budget deficits, cut government debt, and restore what economists thought of as the appropriate balance in the economy, rather than changing the structure of the economy. And of course, the structural adjustment policies were imposed on developing countries through the IMF and the World Bank. And because the countries needed to get loans from the IMF and the World Bank, they would have to undertake these policies as a condition of getting the loans. Whereas the austerity measures that were imposed, that were adopted in the UK, were not externally imposed. They were adopted by governments under the influence of economists who argued this was the right thing to do, and also as an opportunity to downsize the state. So some similarities, some differences, and the main similarity is the cuts to public expenditure. And in both the age of structural adjustment and the age of austerity, those cuts to public expenditure disproportionately impacted on low-income women through the reduction of public services, health, education, water and sanitation, being 3 of the most important ways, and also on the cash transfers. Cash transfers not so much developed in the area of structural adjustment in developing countries, though of course they are much more used now. But the austerity in the UK really was part of an undermining of the welfare state in the UK, so that the well-established system of cash transfers, the real value was completely eroded, and and there were limitations and cuts. So it's a really, in those two ways, low-income women in particular, and in the UK we've done analysis, the Women's Budget Group has done analysis that shows how this disproportionately affected low-income women in Black and ethnic minority communities. So these kinds of cash transfers and services matter such a lot to low-income women because of their low incomes, because of the large amounts of unpaid work they do looking after their families and their communities.
Right. So I think that if I'm looking at your work, one of the papers that you wrote with Ruth Pearson, which really is now a classic of development studies and international development. It was Nimble Fingers Make Cheap Workers in 1981. That was obviously before the SAPs. It was, you were looking at production processes and the way in which capitalism kind of folds in women's labor. So what did your analysis reveal about the nature of the gender division of labor and its place in global capitalist systems of production? But also, I was wondering, given what you've just said, I mean, do you think things have improved in that regard? And how do these measures, such as SAPs, affect sort of, these processes as well?
When we wrote our article on Nimble Fingers, we very much wanted to reject a kind of dichotomy between empowerment and disempowerment. We adopted a much more dialectical approach. We were interested in the way in which the relations of subordination or patriarchy were both deconstructed as a result of women getting jobs in export-oriented manufacturing, and also reconstructed on a new basis. So we found that, yes, women, the subordination of women to their fathers, to their brothers, was weakened, and in many cases it enabled young women to have much more choice over their marriage partner, for instance. But then we also found there was a new basis of subordination constructed on the basis of factory relations, a subordination to the boss, the foreman, and with that went very often sexual harassment, very poor health and safety conditions in the factories. And although you could generally get a higher wage by working in the factory than by working as a maid or an agricultural labourer, you were exposed to new forms of gendered authority. So we argued there was both a deconstruction and a reconstruction going on, and that the benefits that women were able to get from this new work in factories very much depended on how far they were able to organize together. So we argued that collective organization and collective agency was important. And we did find examples, even back in the 70s, of women organizing, often in new ways, not in ways that old-style trade union would necessarily recognize, often because trade unions were not allowed in free trade zones. But nevertheless, women found ways of organizing, often through a work with NGOs that focused on their living conditions in dormitories, or the harassment they faced on their journey to the factories, or their health needs. But this also enabled them to organize collectively. So we didn't see exploitation and empowerment as it were either exploited or you were empowered, that the two could go together. You would be exploited in the sense that a lot of profit would be made from your employment, but not much of the gains would go to you. You could be empowered in the sense that having some money of your own, if you could hang on to it, would empower you in relation to your family. Not all women could hang on to that money because some had to hand it over to their husbands or their fathers, or it was used to fund. They were dutiful daughters. They handed it over to fund the education of younger siblings. So we argued it was a complex situation, and we certainly rejected a kind of naive approach that saw women's participation in the labour market as empowering because they got some money, and just that.
Yeah,
more complicated than that.
But also I was wondering, as you know, there's quite a lot of concern now to increase the labor force participation of women in the economy. And
Yes.
the reason that is given is that, you know, they will have their own income, exactly. But what your work has obviously suggested is that it's much more complex. But also the part of your title, which I'd like to hear a little bit more of, which is sort of, you know, nimble fingers, women, but make cheap workers. And do you think that that sort of, you know, this current mobilization of women into the labor force is still continuing with that cheap labor sort of framework? Or do you think that now women are actually feeling that they can participate more fully in the economy?
It depends which women and what kinds of jobs. So there's been vast expansion of education since for girls in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, since we wrote our paper. And so that means that some young women are in a position to enter into professions. It's very different if you're going to become a lawyer, a teacher, a nurse, than if you're going to get a job on the factory floor. But nevertheless, many, many women are still, and I should add that education, though, that increase in education has not translated into a closing of the gender wage gap. So even if you're in one of these higher level occupations, professions and so forth, nurses get paid a lot less than doctors. Teachers in primary schools get paid a lot less than university teachers. Legal assistants get paid a lot less than lawyers, and probably lawyers who are doing pro bono work for poor communities get paid a lot less than commercial lawyers. So there's still hierarchies there. But I think when you come to jobs which are regarded as, quote, low skilled, because not a lot of training is provided. You're supposed somehow to know how to sew, to know how to take care of people. There's no need to do a lot of training or provide a diploma, employers think, because we're recruiting people who already know how to do these things. And we don't expect them really to need to use their initiative very much. But if they do, they can just draw on some innate knowledge. Those people, many of them women, still get paid very low pay. And one of the things that COVID-19 has revealed, I think, is how much so many of the so-called key workers required to keep the economy and the society going are low paid, very low paid. Key workers, but low paid. So we see that it's a myth that your pay reflects how much you contribute to the economy or the society. Your low pay reflects your low power.
Yes. So I want to come back to this question of low pay and care work in a minute, but I also want to return very briefly to your earlier comment about organizing, women organizing in their own sort of interest. Did that sort of analysis help you or in the sort of, focus your attention on the other work that you have done on human rights, and development? Was that something that came from that further analysis?
It was, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a feminist economist, and I approached the issue of human rights, seeing human rights as an arena for struggle and learning from women's organizations and other organizations of peasants and urban low-income workers and so forth, who were using Dalits in India, who were using human rights as an arena of struggle, as a way of putting forward claims and trying to hold their governments to account, and a bit naming and shaming. My government has signed up for this international treaty that's against discrimination and for guaranteeing economic and social rights, but look, it's not doing that. And so mobilizing evidence and testimony to contest what governments were doing and to hold them accountable. So I've always seen human rights, and my work with Radhika Balakrishnan and James Hines, very much we've seen human rights as an arena of struggle, as a way of trying to hold governments to account, not as a magic bullet by any means, but nevertheless as a useful arena of struggle.
Great, thank you. So that does bring me to this whole issue of care work. And then we've already touched upon work on factory floors or work in the formal economy and the links between those, but also this work on mobilization and organization, which of course, as you remember, Caroline Moser talked about sort of the triple burden, not just the double burden of women. And you very elegantly, I think, articulated the key problem there in your 3 work. So the 3 R's being to recognize care work, to reduce it, and to redistribute it. So why do you think care work is so crucial to address and understand contemporary political economy?
When I articulated the 3 R's framework, it was in a workshop on unpaid work. And I had in mind not only the direct care work, where you're caring for a child or a sick person or an old person, but the larger arena of unpaid work that's needed to support that care work. So the collecting of fuel and water, the cooking and cleaning, so a whole range of tasks which are not directly care work, and which for low-income women in low-income countries, it's these non-directly care tasks that are particularly onerous and burdensome, like the water and the fuel collection. So I had in mind this whole arena of unpaid work, disproportionately done by women and girls. There have been a big flourishing of time use studies all around the world that have shown, when you ask people when did they get up in the morning and what did they do every 15 minutes until they went to bed at night, it's disproportionately women and girls that do this unpaid work, not only the direct care work, but all of the, and if you like, ancillary work that supports that care work. And you have illuminated this in your work on depletion, and how women are, low-income women are so overburdened with not only paid work, but also all of this unpaid work. And I think in every country, this unpaid work that's disproportionately done by women is one of the roots of women's inequality in the labour market. If you look in the UK at the gender wage gap, which still persists, why does it persist? Well, one there are direct cases of discrimination. The TV reporter who's a woman who gets paid a lot less than the TV reporters who are men and who do the same kind of job. But on the whole, of this inequality in the labour market is that women still do most of the unpaid work in the home and the community, and that constrains what they can do in the labour market. So it is at the root, it's really essential to understanding the gendered relations in our economies and the gendered power structures in our economies. So first I argued this should be recognised. There should be data on it. The time use data has been a big step forward. It should be recognised. There should be studies on it. I think we have made big steps in getting recognition in terms of better data, in terms of, now you will see reports from the World Bank and the IMF that speak about unpaid work and the importance of developing policies towards unpaid work. But of course, it's not just data, it's also policy. And with that success in recognition has gone some complexities which we've had to negotiate. I'll come on to those in a minute, but that was the recognition was in data and in policy. Make visible what has been invisible, because it was non-market, still is non-market. The second R was reduce. And I think reduce is particularly important for low-income women in developing countries, because it's about reducing the amount of time you have to spend collecting water, purifying water, collecting fuel, making dung cakes for the fire. If you're an urban woman, low-income woman, spending a lot of time trying to get the cheapest vegetables, food processing at home. So a big burden of what might be better called drudge work in many circumstances. It's not the same as taking care of a child or your loved ones. It's doing all this work that you have to do in order to take the care. And I think reducing that is very important. We've seen some steps forward with more investment in clean water and clean energy, but there are still millions and millions of low-income women in low-income countries that don't have access, or that don't have affordable access, because many of these services are being privatized and you have to pay for them. So there's still a challenge there, although there's been some progress, I think. And of course also the direct care work, moving that from unpaid care to paid care, to both public and private services, both public services and private for-profit services and NGO provided services, care for children, care for people living with severe disabilities, care for frail elderly people. We've seen that rising up the agenda a lot. We've seen governments committing to invest in care services. But one problem has been that although there's been a commitment to invest in care services, this has often meant contracting out those services to private for-profit companies. And so we've learned it's not enough to say we want you to invest in care services. We want you to ensure that these are not used as opportunities to extract profit in ways that lead to deterioration of quality and to very poor conditions of work and pay for the paid care workers. And then the third R was about redistribution between women and men, so that whatever unpaid work remains for taking care of families and communities is not disproportionately done by women. It's not that women are the ones who are expected and internalize those norms themselves and have to do it, but that men and women will share it equally. And that's not something that can be brought about by government edict, but there are ways in which both governments and private sector employers can support changes in that direction. I can say more if we need to. Things like parental leave, obviously, yeah. But those levers for trying to support, to encourage a redistribution of the remaining unpaid work from women in households and communities, the levers that you need for that are easier the more formalized your economy is.
That's right. But I think, so what I want to ask you is that it was, I think, 2000 when, was it not, when you first brought to our attention what happens when these 3 R's are not addressed through depletion. Yes. So I'm just following in your footsteps, yes. Really. And at that time, you had this sort of, idea that if it is not taken, if these 3 R's are not taken care of, depletion leaves the system, basically. But I always remember that wonderful example you gave of that women's labor should not be treated as a rubber band that is endlessly elastic.
Yes, yes.
So given where we are, given what we have talked about in terms of, I'm looking for hope, Diane. And I'm just thinking, where are we now in the 21st century COVID land, where women, as you have just said, their care work as key workers has been so prominent, and yet the support to them has been so absent. So looking forward, do you feel hopeful that the gender gap will close and that the 3 R's, the recognition, reduction, and redistribution of care work will make headway?
On some days I'm optimistic, and on some days I'm pessimistic. I think we can see things that point in both directions. At the moment, we're still in the throes of the crisis, and governments in the South have far fewer resources to deal with this than governments in the North. The UK government can, now it's decided it will borrow. It can borrow whatever it likes in a way that the government of India and South Africa, large though they are, those countries can't borrow in the same way. So we have a big difference in monetary and fiscal capacity between governments. Nevertheless, every government has some room for maneuver. And of course, internationally, we could ensure that governments that don't have much room for maneuver could get more if there were an international move on what people are now calling debt justice. In other words, cancellation of debts, recognition that many of these debts that developing countries have are onerous, can never be repaid, and it's much more sensible, really, just to cancel them and do things. Let's get a bit technical. The things that can be done by the International Monetary Fund to create more space for countries by issuing something called special drawing rights, which is a kind of international money. And there's a lot of support for doing this. The IMF wants to do this, but is being blocked by the current president of the United States. So there are things we know that could be done to give governments more room for maneuver. We don't know yet how far they will be done. But then there's the question of how do governments use that room for maneuver? Do they bail out big companies without putting any conditions on what these companies do in the future? Do they focus their efforts on restoring economic growth without thinking about transformation, without thinking about how they need to support the transformation of economies and societies? So the report that I just, of the commission that I chaired, that's just been launched, which was focusing on the UK in particular, argues we can't just have some kind of build back better. We have to have a new vision for what we've called a caring economy, rooted in equality, well-being and sustainability. And you see a few glimmers of hope because there are some governments, New Zealand is one, that is paying much more attention to well-being. You do see in some countries a growth of understanding that we really need to tackle harmful climate change. We can't just build back, and even build back better, I don't think is good enough. We have to have a much more transformatory approach. But the forms that will take depend on the circumstances of particular countries and particular societies. And people in those countries are right now thinking about what should they press for, what's most important in their particular circumstances. There are international networks where people are sharing ideas on this, and of course that, the way we're doing this interview now, we can do, there's been a lot of blossoming of face-to-face communications via the internet, where people have been sharing ideas. So I hear interesting new ideas, I think that gives me hope, and then I read about the ways that governments are using the context of COVID-19 to increase their authoritarian control under the pretext of, oh, we need to have a lockdown. And those days I become much more depressed.
Oh, Diane, well, such a wonderful and privilege to have had this time with you. And thank you so very much for your thoughts. And I'm sure the students will listen to you and read you, really important, and learn from you. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to this series, and a shout out to all the students who'll be watching this, and best wishes with your studies in these really difficult times.
Thanks, Diane.